The evening sky had darkened to a deep blue as Judge Thomas Washington checked his watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. and the charity gala had run longer than expected. He loosened his bow tie with one hand while steering his black Mercedes with the other. The event had been worthwhile, raising over $200,000 for the youth center, but he was looking forward to getting home and kicking off his dress, shoes. Rain began to fall in light drops against the windshield as he turned onto Oakwood Avenue. His neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the streetlights casting long reflections on the wet pavement. Only 3 more blocks to home. Thomas adjusted the radio, settling on a jazz station playing something smooth and easy. He hummed along, thinking about tomorrow's court schedule. He had a full docket in the morning, which meant an early start. The thought made him yawn. The flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror jolted him from his thoughts. Thomas frowned, checking his speed. He'd been going exactly at the limit, careful as always. For a moment he wondered if the police car was just passing through, responding to something else. But when it stayed directly behind him, he knew. What now? He muttered, signaling and pulling to the curb. He'd been stopped before, more times than most of his colleagues on the bench would believe. Despite his 15 years as a circuit court judge, despite the Mercedes and the tailored suit, despite everything he'd achieved, there was always something. A tail light, a rolling stop, or sometimes no reason given at all. Thomas took a deep breath and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The training his father had given him decades ago was still instinctive. Keep your hands visible, move slowly, speak respectfully, no matter what. Even as a judge, he followed the same rules. Officer James Miller had been on shift since 3 that afternoon. His shoulders were tight with tension from 8 hours of patrol, and the coffee in his cup holder had gone cold an hour ago. The call had come through 20 minutes earlier. A black Mercedes S-Class reported stolen from the hillside neighborhood. And now here one was, same model, same color, plate number matching the report. Miller radioed in his position and stepped out into the light rain. His hand rested near his holster as he approached, standard procedure for a potentially high-risk stop. The car looked expensive, which matched the report. He clicked his flashlight on, directing it first at the license plate to confirm, then at the driver's side window. The beam illuminated a black man in what looked like formal wear. Miller kept his face neutral. Stolen vehicle reports involving luxury cars often meant joyriding or worse. The man inside looked older, maybe in his 50s, but Miller had learned long ago not to make assumptions based on appearance. License and registration, Miller called out, standing slightly behind the driver's door. Position angled for safety. Thomas reached for the button to lower his window, moving deliberately. "Good evening, officer," he said, keeping his voice level. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Miller didn't answer the question. "I need to see your license and registration, sir." Thomas nodded. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my wallet is in my inside jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" "Keep your hands on the wheel for now," Miller said, tension edging his voice. "Is this your vehicle?" The question made Thomas's stomach tighten. He'd been here before. "Yes, it is. I've owned it for about 3 years now." Miller's flashlight beam moved across the car's interior, catching the gleam of Thomas's cufflinks and the leather dashboard. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Thomas blinked, surprised by the escalation. "Officer, may I ask what this is about?" "Sir, I need you to exit the vehicle now." "Keep your hands where I can see them." The rain was falling harder now, creating a pattering sound on the car roof. Thomas carefully opened the door and stepped out, the bottoms of his dress pants immediately darkening with moisture from the wet street. Miller took a step back. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." "Officer, I think there's been some misunderstanding," Thomas said, but complied, the cold metal of his car hood beneath his palms. The rain now speckled his suit jacket. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen approximately an hour ago," Miller explained, his voice professional but firm. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "That's impossible. This is my car. I was at the Children's Future Charity Gala at the Grand Hotel downtown all evening. I'm just heading home." Miller wasn't listening. He'd called for backup, standard procedure for a stolen vehicle stop, and was focused on maintaining control of the situation until it arrived. "I'll need to see some identification." "As I mentioned, my wallet is in my jacket's inner pocket," Thomas said. "May I reach for it?" "Slowly," Miller instructed, his hand still near his holster. The wail of another siren approached in the distance. Lights began to come on in nearby houses, curtains parting as neighbors peered out at the commotion. Thomas carefully reached inside his jacket, hyper-aware of the officer's eyes tracking his every movement. He extracted his wallet and held it out. "My driver's license is in there, along with my bar card and judicial identification." Miller took the wallet, keeping his flashlight trained on Thomas while he examined the contents. He paused, his expression changing slightly as he read the judicial ID. "Judge Thomas Washington, Circuit Court." The backup unit pulled up, lights flashing, adding more swirling red and blue to the rainy scene. Officer Diane Chen stepped out, hand on her holster, approaching cautiously. "What's the situation?" she asked Miller. Miller hesitated. "Possible stolen vehicle, but..." He glanced at the ID again, then at Thomas, still standing with his hands on the hood of the Mercedes, rain now soaking through his expensive suit. Chen looked at Thomas, then back to Miller. "This is Judge Washington," she said quietly, recognition in her voice. Miller nodded, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "I'm verifying the vehicle information now." He returned to his patrol car to run the full plate and VIN check. Thomas remained in position, rain running down his face now. Neighbors had begun to gather on their porches, watching. Some held up phones recording the scene. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar mix of anger and humiliation wash over him. Chen approached, more tentative now. "Judge Washington? Sorry about this. We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description." Thomas nodded. "I understand officers have a job to do," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside. "May I lower my hands now?" "Of course, sir," Chen said quickly. Miller returned, his face difficult to read in the harsh mix of flashlights and patrol car spotlights. "There's been a mistake," he admitted. "The stolen vehicle has a similar plate, but it's different. It's a custom vanity plate. This isn't the vehicle in question." "I see," Thomas said, straightening his soaked suit jacket. "So I'm free to go?" Miller handed back his wallet and documentation. "Yes, sir. Sorry for the inconvenience." Thomas didn't respond immediately. The word inconvenience didn't begin to cover what had just happened. He was standing in the rain, 3 doors down from his own home, having been treated like a criminal. "Officer," Thomas finally said, "I'd like your name and badge number." Miller stiffened slightly but provided the information. Thomas committed it to memory, then glanced around at the neighbors still watching, at their phones still recording. Some he recognized, people who waved to him while he collected his morning paper or walked his dog. Now they were seeing him like this. "Is there anything else?" Thomas asked. Miller shook his head. "No, sir. You're free to go. Drive safely." Thomas got back into his car, the leather seat now feeling cold and uncomfortable against his damp clothes. He sat for a moment, collecting himself, aware of the officers watching him, aware of the neighbors, aware of the familiar weight of it all. He started the engine. The jazz was still playing on the radio, the same smooth saxophone completely at odds with the knot in his stomach. Thomas pulled away from the curb, driving the last 3 blocks to his driveway with perfect precision, using his turn signal even though the streets were empty. As he parked in his garage, Thomas sat in silence after turning off the engine. The overhead light illuminated his reflection in the rearview mirror, a respected judge in a sodden tuxedo, circles under his eyes, a look of weariness that went bone deep. Tomorrow, he would sit on the bench and make decisions that would affect people's lives. He would be called Your Honor and treated with deference. But tonight he was just another black man pulled over in an expensive car, assumed guilty until proven innocent. Thomas finally got out and entered his house through the connecting door. He'd call his friend on the police commission tomorrow. Not to make a complaint. He wasn't sure yet what he wanted to come of this, but because something needed to change. It always needed to change for tonight, though. He just wanted to get out of his wet clothes, pour a drink, and try to wash away the familiar taste of injustice before he had to put on his robes in the morning. Thomas woke before his alarm the next morning, his sleep broken and restless. The rain continued to tap against his bedroom window, matching his uneasy mood. He went through his morning routine mechanically: shower, shave, breakfast, all while replaying last night's events in his mind. His phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with text messages. News traveled fast in this town, especially when it involved someone of his position. By the time he was knotting his tie, he'd received messages from 3 fellow judges, his sister, and the court administrator, all asking variations of, "Are you okay?" And what happened? He hadn't answered any of them yet. What could he say? That once again, he'd been reminded that his judicial robes offered no protection outside the courthouse, that the car he'd saved for, the house in the good neighborhood, the decades of work, none of it mattered during those moments in the rain. Thomas finished his coffee and grabbed his briefcase. He had a courtroom waiting for him, and he couldn't afford to be late. Not today. Not after being seen by his neighbors, hands on the hood of his own car. Officer Miller hadn't slept much either. His shift had ended at midnight, but he'd stayed late completing paperwork on the incident. The stolen vehicle had been recovered around 2 a.m., abandoned near the highway, joy-ridden by teenagers. Nothing to do with Judge Washington or his similar-looking Mercedes. Miller sat in the police station break room now, uniform fresh but eyes tired, nursing a cup of strong coffee. He'd been on the force for 7 years. He knew the protocol for stolen vehicle stops, had followed it by the book. Yet something about last night sat wrong with him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. "Heard you pulled over Judge Washington," said Lieutenant Rivera, dropping into the chair across from him. Her face was carefully neutral, but Miller knew her well enough to read the concern. "Vehicle matched the description," Miller replied. "Wasn't until I saw his ID that I realized who he was." Rivera nodded. "His name came across my desk this morning. He called Commissioner Hanson." Miller felt his stomach tighten. "Am I in trouble?" Rivera shrugged. "No complaint filed yet, but there's body cam footage to review. And now a video from someone's doorbell camera is making rounds online. Shows the judge standing in the rain, hands on his car." "I followed protocol," Miller said defensively. "I know you did," Rivera said, "but this is complicated. Washington's respected in this city. Sits on the community relations board with the chief. They play golf together." Miller set down his coffee cup. "So what happens now?" "Internal Affairs will review the footage. Standard procedure. But off the record. Tread carefully. This could blow up." At the courthouse, Thomas moved through his morning docket with practiced efficiency. Traffic violations, small claims disputes, a restraining order hearing. The routine cases required his attention but not his full concentration, allowing his mind to wander back to the previous night. During a brief recess, his clerk handed him a note. Commissioner Hanson called again. Said it's urgent. Thomas nodded. Frank Hanson had been calling since 7 a.m. As the police commissioner and Thomas's occasional golf partner, he was no doubt eager to smooth things over. To handle it quietly, Thomas wasn't sure what he wanted yet, wasn't sure what response would satisfy the anger still simmering beneath his judicial demeanor. He was about to return to the courtroom when his phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Gerald. "You're on YouTube." Doorbell camera caught everything last night. Thomas felt a wave of heat rise to his face. He quickly searched and found the video, already at 17,000 views. The footage showed him from behind, standing in the rain beside his Mercedes, hands on the hood, while the 2 officers conferred nearby. The angle didn't capture his face clearly, but the title made his identity clear. Local judge profiled in his own neighborhood. The comments section was already a battleground, some expressing outrage, others defending the officers, many sharing similar experiences. Thomas closed the browser, took a deep breath, and returned to the bench. The world outside could wait. In this room, at least, he still had control. After court adjourned for lunch, Thomas finally returned Commissioner Hanson's call. "Thomas, thank God," Hanson said, skipping the pleasantries. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. I've seen the video." "Frank," Thomas acknowledged. "I was in court. Of course. Listen, I want you to know I'm taking this very seriously. Officer Miller's body camera footage is being reviewed right now. If any protocols were violated, they weren't," Thomas interrupted. "He did everything by the book. That's part of the problem." A pause. "I'm not sure I follow. He had a report of a stolen vehicle. He saw my car, which matched the description. He followed procedure. keeping me in what he considered a potentially dangerous situation until he could confirm my identity and the status of the vehicle. Right, Hansen said cautiously. So you're not filing a complaint? Thomas looked out his chamber window at the rain-slicked street below. What would a complaint accomplish, Frank? Another officer reprimanded? Sensitivity training? A note in a file? We could meet, Hansen suggested. You, me, the chief. Discuss how to handle this. I'd like to meet with Officer Miller, Thomas said, surprising himself with the decision. Just him and me. No cameras, no press, no official record. I don't know if that's wise, Hansen said hesitantly. With the video circulating, it's what I want, Thomas said firmly. Set it up for tomorrow. My chambers after court. And Frank, keep it quiet. After ending the call, Thomas sat back in his leather chair, contemplating his request. Was he seeking an apology? An explanation? Or was there something else he needed from this officer who had followed all the rules while making him feel like a criminal in front of his own home? Miller received the summons to Judge Washington's chambers with a mixture of dread and confusion. Lieutenant Rivera delivered it personally at the end of his shift. He wants to meet with me. Why? Miller asked. Didn't say. But if I were you, I'd shine my shoes and mind my manners, Rivera advised. Judge Washington doesn't mess around. Miller spent that evening researching Thomas Washington, his 20-year legal career, his rise to the bench, his reputation for fairness but firmness in sentencing. He found articles about Washington's community work, his advocacy for juvenile justice reform, his occasional public statements on racial disparities in the system. One quote from a newspaper interview 3 years earlier caught Miller's attention. Justice isn't blind, Washington had said. She sees everything, race, class, privilege. My job is to make sure she weighs those things properly, not pretends they don't exist. Miller's wife Carla found him still at the computer at midnight. Come to bed, she urged. Staring at his bio won't change what happened. I'm trying to understand what he wants from me, Miller said. A public apology? My badge? Carla squeezed his shoulder. Maybe he just wants to be seen as a person, not a profile. The next day, Thomas finished court early, dismissing his clerk and telling his bailiff he didn't want to be disturbed. At precisely 4 p.m., there was a knock at his chamber door. Come in, he called. Officer Miller entered, uniform pressed, expression carefully neutral. He stood at attention, almost as if reporting for duty. Have a seat, officer, Thomas said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Miller sat stiffly. Thank you for meeting with me, Your Honor. Thomas studied him. Younger than he'd appeared in the rain, maybe early 30s. Brown hair cut short, clean-shaven, a wedding ring on his left hand. Eyes that revealed nervousness despite his rigid posture. Do you know why I asked you here? Thomas began. I assume it's about the traffic stop 2 nights ago, sir. If I made an error in procedure. You didn't, Thomas interrupted. As I told Commissioner Hansen, you followed protocol. But I want to hear from you, in your own words, what you saw that night when you pulled me over. Miller shifted slightly. I saw a vehicle matching the description of a stolen car. I initiated a traffic stop and approached with caution, as trained for potentially high-risk situations. And when you saw me? Thomas pressed. What did you see then? Miller hesitated. A driver in formal attire. A black driver, Thomas corrected quietly. Miller swallowed. Yes, sir. Did that factor into your assessment of the situation? I followed standard protocol for all stolen vehicle stops, Miller said carefully. Thomas leaned forward. That wasn't my question, Officer Miller. The room fell silent. Rain pattered against the window, the only sound as Miller struggled with his answer. I don't know, he finally admitted. I'd like to say no. I'd like to believe I would have handled it exactly the same regardless. But I can't be certain, and that's troubling to me. Thomas hadn't expected such honesty. He'd anticipated defensiveness, perhaps even hostility. This acknowledgement of uncertainty was something else entirely. I've been a judge for 15 years, Thomas said after a moment. Before that, a prosecutor, a defense attorney. I've spent my entire adult life in the justice system, and in all that time I've been pulled over 27 times. 27 stops, 7 different cars I've owned, 5 different neighborhoods I've lived in. Only 3 resulted in tickets. Miller remained silent, eyes now fixed on Thomas. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, Thomas continued. I'm telling you because I need you to understand something that's going to be essential to both our futures in this city. What happened between us wasn't about a stolen car report. It was about something much older and deeper than that night in the rain. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him, impossibly loud in the silence of the judge's chambers. Outside, rain continued to fall, creating a gentle background rhythm that contrasted with the tension in the room. 27 times, Miller finally said, "That's a lot. More than most of my white colleagues will experience in their lifetime," Thomas agreed. "The first time was when I was 16, driving my mother's car to pick up groceries. The most recent was with you 3 nights ago." Thomas stood walking to the window. From his chambers he could see the courthouse steps, people hurrying up and down with umbrellas going about their business in the rain. "Did you know that video has over 100,000 views now?" he asked, his back to Miller. "No, sir," Miller replied. "I haven't looked." I'm not in the habit of reading comment sections, but it's fascinating how quickly people choose sides. Half are calling for your badge, saying you racially profiled a respected judge. The other half are defending you, saying you were just doing your job. Thomas turned back to face him. They're both right in a way. Miller took a deep breath. "Judge Washington, I want to apologize." Thomas held up a hand. "I didn't ask you here for an apology. I asked you here because I want to understand something. When you realized who I was, that I was a judge, not a car thief, what went through your mind?" Miller hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, first I was afraid I'd made a career-ending mistake. Then I felt embarrassed. And then defensive because I'd followed procedure. And at any point, did you think about how I felt?" The question hung in the air. Miller's eyes dropped to his hands. "Not really," he admitted. "Not until later that night." Thomas nodded as if confirming something to himself. He returned to his desk and sat down. "I was 16 when my father first taught me what to do when, not if, but when, I got pulled over. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Say yes, officer, and no, officer. Don't argue even if you know you're right." He was a city bus driver for 30 years and he was stopped more times than he could count. Miller listened, his face showing genuine interest now rather than just professional courtesy. "I've been a lawyer for 25 years, a judge for 15. I've sent people to prison. I've granted restraining orders that saved lives. I've made decisions that changed families forever. And yet, standing in the rain the other night, hands on my car hood, neighbors watching, I was just a black man being stopped by police again." Miller nodded slowly. "I understand that must be frustrating." "No," Thomas interrupted firmly but not unkindly. "You don't understand. You can't. That's not a criticism. It's simply a fact. Just like I can't fully understand what it's like to be a police officer, to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death." Miller's phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached to silence it without looking. "It's all right," Thomas said. "Check it." "Might be important." Miller hesitated, then glanced at his phone. His expression changed subtly. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "Lieutenant Rivera," Miller said. "The chief wants to see me when I'm done here. Says the mayor's office is getting involved now because of the video." "Politics," Thomas sighed. "The mayor's up for re-election next year. Can't have racial profiling scandals on her watch." He leaned back in his chair. "What do you think should happen now, Officer Miller?" The question caught Miller off guard. "Sir? With the situation? The video? The fallout? What do you think is the right way forward?" Miller considered this, clearly uncomfortable with being asked his opinion by a judge he'd wrongfully detained days earlier. "I think I should face whatever consequences come from a proper review of my actions," he said finally. "If I made mistakes, I should be held accountable. And if a review finds you followed all protocols correctly, what then? Then I should still learn from this. Maybe the protocols themselves need examining." Thomas smiled slightly. The first time he'd smiled during their conversation. "That's a more thoughtful answer than I expected." A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas's bailiff poked his head in. "Sorry to disturb you, Judge, but there's a situation developing outside. The press is here and some protesters too. They somehow got wind of this meeting." Thomas frowned. "How many?" "2 news vans, maybe 30 people with signs. Someone tipped them off." Thomas looked at Miller. "Did you tell anyone about our meeting?" Miller shook his head. "Just my lieutenant and my wife. Same here. Just the commissioner." Thomas sighed. All right, thank you, Paul. Please make sure no one comes up. The bailiff nodded and closed the door. Thomas turned back to Miller. Looks like our private conversation is now public knowledge. This changes things. Miller stood up. I should go. Deal with the chief, face the cameras. Sit down, Officer Miller. We're not finished. Thomas's tone was calm but commanding, the same voice he used in his courtroom. Miller sat. The easy path would be for me to file a formal complaint. You'd receive some form of discipline, probably minor given that you followed protocol. The department would issue a statement about reviewing procedures. The mayor would call for unity. Everyone would move on until the next incident. And the harder path? Miller asked quietly. We actually try to change something. Thomas leaned forward. I've spent years in community forums talking about police-community relations. I've sat on boards, issued recommendations, spoken at conferences, and yet I still ended up with my hands on my car hood in the rain, being treated like a criminal 3 doors from my own house. Outside the window, they could hear the faint sound of chanting now. The protesters were making themselves heard. What are you suggesting? Miller asked. I'm suggesting we use this moment. The video, the press attention, even the protesters, instead of becoming another statistic in the endless cycle of incidents and outrage, maybe we can build something constructive. Miller looked skeptical. With all due respect, Judge, that sounds like politician talk. What does something constructive actually mean? Thomas appreciated the candor. Fair question. I'm thinking of a community initiative. Officers paired with community leaders, not for one-off diversity training sessions, but for ongoing dialogue. Regular meetings, ride-alongs, open forums where both sides can speak freely. With you and me as the first participants. Miller blinked in surprise. You want to work with me? After what happened? Because of what happened, Thomas corrected. You've shown something rare today, Officer Miller. The willingness to question yourself, to admit uncertainty. Most people can't do that, especially in uniform. Before Miller could respond, Thomas's phone rang. He checked the screen. It's the commissioner again, probably calling about the crowd outside. He declined the call. They're going to want statements from both of us, Thomas continued. The press, the department, the mayor's office. Everyone will want their soundbite. But what if we gave them something unexpected? What do you have in mind? Miller asked. A joint statement. Not me calling for your head, not you defending yourself, but both of us acknowledging what happened, why it happened, and what we're going to do about it. Miller considered this. My union rep would advise against it. And my colleagues would say I'm being too soft, Thomas replied. But I'm not interested in what's politically expedient. I'm interested in what might actually make a difference. The chanting outside grew louder. They could make out words now. Justice and accountability. They want a villain and a victim, Thomas said. What they don't realize is that we're both caught in something bigger than either of us. The question is, do we have the courage to step outside those roles? Miller was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he straightened in his chair, decision made. What would this joint statement say? Thomas smiled again, more genuinely this time. Let's figure that out together. He reached for a legal pad. But first, tell me something about yourself that isn't in your personnel file. If we're going to work together, I should know who you are beyond the badge. As the rain continued to fall outside and the protesters continued their chants, the two men began a different kind of conversation, not as officer and judge, not as profiles in a heated social media debate, but as individuals trying to find common ground in uncommon circumstances. And for the first time since that night in the rain, both men felt something they hadn't expected. Hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from this after all. The rain had finally stopped by the time Thomas and Miller stepped out of the courthouse side entrance. They had chosen this less-used door hoping to avoid the crowd, but word had spread quickly. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Behind them, protesters held signs with phrases like "Justice Now" and "End Profiling." Judge Washington. Officer Miller! Can we get a statement? Thomas raised his hand, and somehow the gesture commanded enough respect to quiet the crowd. Miller stood slightly behind him, face composed but eyes revealing his discomfort. My name is Thomas Washington. 3 nights ago, I was pulled over by Officer James Miller near my home. A video of that encounter has been circulating online, causing understandable concern in our community. Thomas's voice carried across the courthouse steps, steady and clear. Officer Miller and I have spent the afternoon in private conversation about that incident and its wider implications. A reporter shouted, "Will you be filing a complaint against the officer?" "No," Thomas replied. "Instead, we're announcing a new community initiative that Officer Miller and I will be co-chairing. A dialogue series bringing together law enforcement and community members for honest conversations about policing, race, and mutual respect." The reporters erupted with more questions. Miller stepped forward, surprising even Thomas. "If I may," he said, his voice less practiced at public speaking but firm. "What happened that night was by the book procedurally, but it highlighted deeper issues we need to address. Judge Washington has shown remarkable leadership by suggesting we work together rather than against each other. I'm honored to accept his invitation." The unexpected nature of their joint appearance created a momentary hush before the questions started again. Commissioner Hanson pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. "We should talk privately," he murmured to Thomas. "We've had enough privacy for today," Thomas replied, just loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. "This needs to be transparent from the start." Later that evening, Thomas sat in his living room watching the news coverage with his wife Patrice. Their joint statement had made the lead story on every local channel. "Bold move," Patrice said, curled beside him on the couch. As a hospital administrator, she understood institutional politics all too well. "The mayor called me at work, you know. Wanted to know if you'd lost your mind." Thomas smiled slightly.
"What did you tell her?"
"That you'd found it, actually." She squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you. But are you sure about this, Officer Miller? Can he be trusted?" Thomas considered the question. "I'm not sure yet, but he showed something today I didn't expect, humility. That's rare enough to be worth exploring." Across town, Miller faced a different kind of interrogation at his kitchen table. His wife Carla set a plate of lasagna in front of him while peppering him with questions. "So you're not suspended? No disciplinary action at all?" Miller shook his head. The chief was confused, said he'd never seen anything like it. A judge who could have filed a career-ending complaint instead asking to work with the officer who stopped him. "And you agreed to this?" Carla asked, sitting across from him. "What does it actually involve?" "We're still working out the details." Miller pushed his food around the plate, appetite diminished by the day's stress. "Community forums, ride-alongs, training sessions. The chief is assigning me to it full-time for the next 3 months." Carla studied her husband's face. "You seem unsure." Miller put down his fork. "When I became a cop, I wanted to help people, make a difference. 7 years later, I'm spending most shifts writing tickets and filling out paperwork. Maybe this is a chance to do something meaningful." He paused. "Plus, there's something about the judge. He could have buried me, but he didn't." "Just be careful," Carla warned. "Once the cameras leave, you'll be out there alone if this goes south." The next morning, Thomas arrived early at his chambers to find a stack of messages and a harried clerk. "The phone's been ringing nonstop," she told him. "Every news outlet in the state, the mayor's office 3 times, and the NLACP wants you to speak at their conference next month." Thomas nodded. "And my docket for today?" "Still full, but the Chief Justice called. He's offering to reassign your cases if you need time for this initiative." Thomas smiled at her careful phrasing. "Tell him I appreciate the offer, but I'll continue my regular duties. This work happens alongside, not instead." By mid-morning, Miller arrived at the courthouse as arranged. He'd traded his uniform for khakis and a button-down shirt, still neat but less authoritative. The bailiff escorted him through the now empty courtroom to the judge's chambers. Thomas was on the phone but waved him in. "Yes, Congressman, I understand your concern. But with respect, we're keeping this local for now. No, I don't need federal oversight." He glanced at Miller. "I need to go. My partner in this venture has just arrived." He hung up and sighed. "Politicians. Suddenly everyone wants a piece of this." Miller nodded. "Same at the department. Officers I barely know are stopping by my desk, half thinking I've lost my mind, half wondering if I found a way to fast-track promotion." "And what do you think?" Thomas asked. "I think we need to figure out what we're actually doing before everyone else defines it for us." Thomas smiled. "Exactly. Let's get to work." Over the next few weeks, their unlikely partnership took shape. They drafted a framework for community dialogues, not the usual staged town halls where officials made speeches and citizens got 2 minutes at a microphone. but facilitated conversations with equal numbers from law enforcement and neighborhoods, focused on specific issues and actionable outcomes. Their first test was a small gathering at a community center in the Westwood district, an area with historically tense police relations. Thomas arrived early to find Miller already there, arranging chairs in a circle rather than the usual rows facing a podium. "Good thinking," Thomas commented, helping to adjust the layout. "No hierarchy tonight," Miller nodded. "Learned that from my lieutenant. Said if you want real talk, make sure nobody's looking down on anybody else." People began arriving, 8 officers in plain clothes and 8 community members, ranging from a grandmother who led the neighborhood watch to a 20-something youth counselor with visible wariness in his eyes. Thomas and Miller welcomed them, explaining the unusual format. "We're here to listen as much as talk," Thomas explained. "Officer Miller and I have a story to share, but it's just the beginning. We want to hear yours too." What followed surprised everyone. After Thomas and Miller recounted their encounter and subsequent conversations, others began sharing, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness. An older officer described his changing views over 30 years on the force. A young woman told of being followed through stores by security since she was 12. A rookie cop admitted his fear during night patrols in unfamiliar neighborhoods. No one shouted. No one stormed out. They just talked and, more importantly, listened. Afterward, as they gathered their materials, Miller seemed thoughtful. "That was different," he said. "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Thomas asked. "Anger. Accusations, the usual walls going up." Miller shrugged. "Instead, people actually seemed to hear each other." "It's just a start," Thomas cautioned. "One good conversation doesn't change decades of history." "No," Miller agreed. "But it's something." As word spread of their initial success, requests came in from other neighborhoods, schools, even the police academy. The local paper ran a feature story headlined, "From Confrontation to Conversation. Judge and Officer forge unexpected partnership." Not everyone approved. Thomas received anonymous calls questioning his loyalty to the black community. Miller faced cold shoulders from some fellow officers who saw him as pandering. The police union expressed concerns about the precedent being set. Through it all, Thomas and Miller continued their work, refining their approach with each forum. They weren't friends exactly. The gap in their experiences and positions remained significant. But they developed a genuine respect for each other's perspectives. 6 weeks after their first meeting in the judge's chambers, they sat in Thomas's car outside the police precinct, reviewing notes from that evening's forum. "The chief wants to expand this to the county level," Miller said. "Thinks it could be a model for other departments." Thomas nodded. "The judicial conference is interested too. Several judges have asked about implementing something similar in their districts." Miller hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind. "Do you think this actually changes anything? Or are we just talking, while the same problems continue?" Thomas considered this seriously. "When I was pulled over that night, I felt something I've felt many times before. Powerless despite all my supposed authority. What's different now isn't just that we're talking. It's that we're listening. And that's where change begins." As Miller got out of the car, he paused. "For what it's worth, I wouldn't have made that stop the same way now." Thomas smiled slightly. "Progress, Officer Miller. That's all we can ask for." The rain began again as Thomas drove home, gentle and steady against his windshield. But unlike that night 6 weeks ago, it felt less like an omen and more like a cleansing, washing away old assumptions to make room for new possibilities. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when Officer Miller pulled Judge Washington over near his home. The seasons had changed, summer heat giving way to autumn coolness, leaves turning gold and red across the city. And just as the landscape had transformed, so too had the relationship between the two men who now stood side by side at the podium in City Hall. The room was packed, police officers in uniform and plain clothes, community activists, city officials, ordinary citizens who had participated in their forums. At the back, news cameras recorded the moment for the evening broadcasts. "When we began this journey," Thomas addressed the crowd. Many people were skeptical. Some thought it was a publicity stunt. Others believed nothing would change. A few were even angry that we chose dialogue over division. He glanced at Miller, who nodded encouragement. They had good reason for doubt. One conversation doesn't erase decades of mistrust. One program doesn't solve systemic problems. Miller stepped forward to the microphone. Over the past 6 months, we've held 37 community forums in every district of this city. More than 800 citizens and 300 police officers have participated. We've had difficult conversations, uncomfortable moments, and genuine breakthroughs, Thomas continued. Today, we're here to present our findings and recommendations to the mayor and city council. He held up a bound report. This document represents the collective wisdom of everyone who participated, their concerns, their ideas, and most importantly, their commitment to building a safer community with fair and equal policing. After they concluded their presentation, the mayor approached the podium. She had been cautious about their initiative at first, worried about political fallout. Now she smiled broadly for the cameras. On behalf of the city, I want to thank Judge Washington and Officer Miller for their extraordinary leadership. I'm pleased to announce that the City Council has approved funding to implement their recommended changes, including expanded community policing, revised training protocols, and a civilian oversight committee with actual authority. Applause filled the room. Thomas and Miller exchanged glances, both recognizing the political theater at play but appreciating the concrete results. Their work was moving from conversation to action. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Commissioner Hansen pulled them aside. "The state police commissioner called me this morning," he said quietly. "They want to implement your program statewide. This could go national, gentlemen." Thomas nodded politely but didn't share Hansen's obvious excitement. He'd learned over months of community forums that expansion without depth meant little. Quick adoption of their model by other cities looking for good press wouldn't necessarily translate to meaningful change. As they walked out of City Hall together, Miller sensed Thomas's reservation. "You don't seem thrilled about going statewide," he observed. Thomas sighed. "I'm thinking about Kevin." Kevin was a 16-year-old boy they'd met at their forum in Riverdale last month. He'd stood up, voice shaking, and described being stopped and searched by police 3 times in 1 week while walking home from basketball practice. "He's still getting stopped," Thomas continued. "All our talking, all our recommendations, all the positive press, and that boy still gets treated like a criminal for walking while black." Miller was quiet for a moment. "I know. That's why we added the accountability metrics to the report, so we can track whether these changes actually reduce stops like his." "But will they?" Thomas asked. "Or will we just get better at documenting the problem?" It was an ongoing tension in their partnership. Thomas pushing for faster, more substantial change, Miller emphasizing the realities of institutional transformation. What made their work effective was that neither man yielded entirely to the other's perspective. They kept each other honest. "Come on," Miller said. "I want to show you something." They drove across town to the police academy where Miller had arranged something special. Inside the main training hall, 30 new police cadets sat in a semicircle, facing 4 teenagers from the youth center in Riverdale, including Kevin. "What's this?" Thomas asked quietly. "New training module," Miller explained, "based on your suggestion that officers should hear directly from young people about how police interactions affect them." Thomas watched as Kevin spoke to the cadets, describing how it felt to be stopped repeatedly, how he'd learned to keep his hands visible at all times, how he avoided certain streets even if it meant a longer walk home. The cadets listened intently. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful. When Kevin finished, one young woman raised her hand. "I joined the academy because I want to help people," she said. "How can I show kids like you that's what I'm trying to do?" Kevin considered the question seriously. "Talk to me like I'm a person first, not a suspect. Tell me why you stopped me. Listen if I try to explain." Simple requests, Thomas thought. Basic human dignity, yet so often denied. After the session, Kevin spotted them and came over, breaking into a smile. "Judge Washington, Officer Miller. Did you see that? They actually listened to us." Thomas felt a surge of hope watching Kevin's enthusiasm. This was why they kept going despite the slow pace of change. Moments like this when a young person felt heard perhaps for the first time. As they left the academy, Miller asked, "Feel better?" Thomas nodded. "It's a start. One cadet at a time." "Speaking of starts," Miller said, "I got the transfer approved. Starting next month, I'll be heading the new Community Engagement Division. 5 officers to start, hopefully more next budget cycle." "Congratulations," Thomas said sincerely. They chose the right person. Their unlikely partnership had changed them both. Miller had risen through the department ranks not by avoiding difficult conversations about race and policing, but by leaning into them. Thomas had found a way to address systemic issues from within the system rather than merely criticizing from the bench. They weren't friends exactly. Their lives and experiences remained too different for casual friendship, but they had developed something perhaps more valuable: mutual respect and a shared commitment to difficult, necessary work. 1 year to the day after their fateful encounter, they met for coffee at a small shop halfway between the courthouse and the police station. It had become a monthly ritual, checking in outside the formal structures of their program. "I got stopped last week," Thomas said conversationally, stirring his coffee. Taillight was out. "Didn't even realize it." Miller looked up sharply. "How did it go?" "Officer was professional, respectful. Told me why she stopped me right away." Thomas smiled slightly. "She recognized me, of course. Hard to be anonymous in this town anymore." "Would it have gone the same if she hadn't recognized you?" Miller asked. "That's always the question, isn't it?" Thomas replied. "But at least now it's a question more officers are asking themselves." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "The new stats came in yesterday. Discretionary stops down 18% citywide. Complaints down 23%. Arrests for serious crimes holding steady. So we're stopping fewer people without affecting public safety," Thomas noted. "Almost like we don't need to treat everyone as a threat." "Almost," Miller agreed with the hint of a smile. A young officer approached their table hesitantly, clearly recognizing them both. "Excuse me, Judge Washington, Officer Miller. I just wanted to say thank you. Your program changed how I approach this job." After she left, Thomas looked at Miller. "One person at a time. It adds up," Miller replied. Outside, rain began to fall, a gentle spring shower, nothing like the downpour of that night a year ago. Thomas watched the droplets trace paths down the window, remembering how it had felt to stand in the rain with his hands on his car hood. Neighbors watching. "I've been thinking about writing a book," he said suddenly, "about our work together. Not just the program, but the whole story, starting with that traffic stop." Miller considered this, including the uncomfortable parts. "My assumptions that night, especially those parts," Thomas replied. "People need the whole truth, not a sanitized version." Miller nodded slowly. "I'd have to be honest about things I'm not proud of." "That's what makes it valuable," Thomas said. "Your willingness to examine those things publicly." They continued talking as the rain fell outside. Two men from different worlds who had found common purpose in the aftermath of an incident that could have driven them apart. Their work was far from done. Both knew that lasting change would take years, not months. But they had created something significant, a model for turning confrontation into conversation, tension into transformation, and somewhere across town, a 16-year-old named Kevin walked home from basketball practice, noticing the police car that passed him by without stopping. A small victory, perhaps, but one that meant everything to him, one person at a time. It was adding up.